Okay, so today we're going to look at the second part of 7-2, which is still factoring out the greatest common factor, but this time it's going to look like to you as if this is a much more complicated problem, but it's actually much easier than what you think it is. So there are actually two terms here. The two terms are separated by a subtraction sign outside of parentheses. So there's one term, and this is the second term. So this subtraction sign right here is separating the polynomial into one term and two terms. They look very complicated, but it's not. We need to find the greatest common factor. So remember that factors are things that are multiplied together. For instance, the factors of 12, things that multiply to give you 12, would be 1 and 12, 2 and 6, and 3 and 4. These are all pairs of numbers that multiply to give you 12. So 3 is a factor and 4 is a factor of 12. 2 is a factor and 6 is a factor of 12, and so forth. So as you look at this term here, we're looking at the things that are being multiplied together. 7 is being multiplied to x minus 3, this whole thing in parentheses. So 7 is a factor of this term, and x minus 3 is a factor of this term. Then come over to the second term. Negative 2 is a factor of this term. X is a factor of this term. And this whole thing, x minus 3, is a factor of this term. So this term has three factors, negative 2, x, and the whole thing, x minus 3. You cannot separate this x from this. It comes together as one group. And this has two factors, 7 and x minus 3. Well, what you hear is that these both have a common factor. Let me erase. I'm trying to erase. It's not letting me erase. Why not? Hang on. Technical difficulties. Seriously? All right. Let's try again. Erase, please. Huh. Weird. All right, let's try this. Yes. All right. Got to outsmart the technology. Okay, so they actually have this in common and this in common as their GCF. So our GCF is equal, and I'm going to leave it in parentheses, to x minus 3. So same as we did in part 1, we're going to divide each term, so there's my two terms, by the GCF, x minus 3, x minus 3. And that GCF has to come out in front of parentheses. So here's my big set of parentheses. And we're going to do our division. So the only thing that in x minus 3 can cancel with is another x minus 3. So for instance, this little x right here cannot be canceled with this x because this is in parentheses and the whole thing is x minus 3. The minus 3 has to come with the x. So I can't cancel this x with that x. What I can do is cancel the x minus 3 with the x minus 3, and essentially I'm taking it away. So these cancel, and I'm left with 7. These two cancel, and I'm left with negative 2x. So whatever's left over gets to go in the parentheses, just like we did yesterday. It just looks slightly more complicated. So the 7 goes here, and the minus 2x goes here. And then this is our final answer. All addition and subtraction signs are now inside parentheses, and we're done. Let's go to example 6. Okay, so on example 6, we have the same thing. See what's in parentheses is identical. So whatever's in parentheses, if they are identical, then they are common to both of them, and you can factor them out. So we're going to do the same thing that we just did. Our GCF is equal to the t squared plus 4. Because remember, negative t is a factor because it's being multiplied to this whole thing, t squared plus 4. This is separating it into the next factor, which is this. t squared plus 4. It's the only factor here because technically there's a 1 here. So we are going to divide by that greatest common factor. So divide both terms by the t squared plus 4 and the t squared plus 4. And of course that t squared plus 4 has to come out in front of parentheses, as we do with all greatest common factors. So these cancel and I'm left with a negative t, so that comes down here. These cancel and I'm left with nothing, but remember we said there is technically a 1 in front of there. So remember, anything divided by itself is always 1. And so technically, as we wrote there, we have this positive 1 in, that's left after we cancel it out, and so we have a negative t plus 1. So our final answer is t squared plus 4 times negative t plus 1. Let's look at example 7. Okay, so for example 7, it almost looks right, but something looks wrong, don't you think? What is wrong with these two here? Well, they both have an x, and they both have a plus 4. But they're not in the same order. So the question you have to ask yourself, does the order of addition matter? Yes or no? So here's just a little example. Is 3 plus 2, which is 5, is that the same as changing their order of addition to 2 plus 3? Yes, they're both 5. It doesn't matter what order you add in, you still get the same answer. So couldn't I change this one, let's say, instead of 4 plus x, I could just change it to an x plus 4. No problem. So now their GCF is what they both have in common, which is in what's in parentheses, which is the x plus 4. So we can divide both terms by the x plus 4. And then cancel out what we have, which are these right here. And then don't forget, of course, that that greatest common factor of x plus 4 needs to be brought in front of parentheses. And we are going to put in the second set of parentheses what's left over after we divide out the x plus 4. And then this time I have left a minus 5 for the second term. So since all addition and subtraction signs are now in parentheses, we are done. Example 8. So on this one, we have an x plus 2 inside parentheses and we have an x minus 7. Well, they're not the same, so they can't be our greatest common factor. So let's look at the other things that will be multiplied. So over here I have a negative 3 times an x squared times this. So this has 3 factors. This has 2, 4 times x minus 7. Well, the negative 3 and the 4 do not have any common factors. I cannot divide 3 into 4, nor is there anything that divides into 3 that would go into 4. This has an x squared. This doesn't, because this does not count as an x. It's inside parentheses. It has to go with the minus 7. So this has no x's that I can cancel or take away from each of them. And since they have nothing in common, the answer is going to look like this. The answer is not factorable. And the reason that it is not factorable is none of the terms have any common factors. So sometimes not everything is factorable, and sometimes we just have to say, can't do it, but do make sure that you've done everything correctly. All right. And then your homework for today is page 467, 12 through 14 all, and 37 through 42 all. Good luck, and come see me if you need some help.